Prince Charles had used the night to reach Ratisbon, whose bridge he used to pass his baggage and the better part of his troops to the left bank of the Danube. It was then that one recognized how great the emperor's foresight had been when, at the opening of the campaign, he had ordered Marshal Davout, coming from Hamburg and Hanover, to join the Grand Army on the right bank of the Danube near Augsburg, to secure possession of Ratisbon and its bridge by leaving a regiment there. Davout had posted in that town the 65th Line, commanded by Colonel Coutard, his kinsman, to whom he wished to give the opportunity to distinguish himself by a fine defense. But Coutard could not hold out, and, after a few hours of fighting, surrendered Ratisbon to the Austrians, the bridge of which guaranteed their retreat after our victory at Eckmühl. Otherwise, they would have been forced to lay down their arms. Colonel Coutard, having stipulated that he and the officers of the 65th Line would alone be sent back to France, the Emperor decreed that, from then on, the officers of a corps reduced to capitulation would follow the fate of their soldiers, which should induce commanders to make a more spirited resistance. However, the Emperor could not move on Vienna without having retaken Ratisbon. Otherwise, as soon as he had gone away, Prince Charles, crossing the Danube by the bridge of that town, would have brought his army back to the right bank and attacked ours from the rear. It was therefore imperative, at all costs, to seize the place. Marshal Lannes was charged with this difficult mission. The enemy had 6,000 men in Ratisbon, and could, by means of the bridge, increase that number at will. They placed a great deal of artillery on the ramparts, while the infantry manned the parapets. The fortifications of Ratisbon were very old, in poor condition. The ditches were dry and cultivated with vegetables. Nevertheless, although these means of defense were insufficient to resist a regular siege, the town was in a position to repel a coup de main, all the more easily because the garrison communicated with an army of more than 80,000 men, and because, to enter the place, one had to descend with ladders into a deep ditch, cross it under the enemy's fire, and finally scale the rampart, the angles of which, flanked with guns, enfiladed each other. The Emperor, having dismounted, went to post himself on a little mound at a short cannon shot from the town. Having noticed, near the gate called the Straubing Gate, a house that had imprudently been built against the rampart wall, he had the 12-pounders, together with the reserve howitzers, brought forward, and ordered all fire to be directed on that house. By collapsing into the ditch, it would partly fill it and form, at the foot of the wall, a ramp by which our troops could climb to the assault. While our artillery executed this order, Marshal Lannes had Division Morand brought up near the promenade that runs around the town, and, to shelter his troops from the enemy's fire until the moment of attack, he placed them behind an immense stone barn, which a most fortunate chance seemed to have placed there to favor our enterprise. Wagons filled with ladders taken from neighboring villages were brought to that point, where one was perfectly protected from the projectiles that the Austrians showered abundantly. While everything was being prepared for the assault, Marshal Lannes, having gone to the Emperor to receive his final orders, was talking with him when an enemy bullet, probably fired from the top of the ramparts by one of those very long-range carbines used by the Tyroleans, struck Napoleon in the ankle of his right foot. The pain was at first so intense that the Emperor, no longer able to stand, had to lean on Marshal Lannes. Dr. Larry hurried up and found the wound to be quite slight. Had it been severe enough to require surgery, one would certainly have considered this event a great misfortune for France. Nevertheless, it might perhaps have spared him many calamities. However, the rumor spread through the army that the Emperor had been wounded. Officers and soldiers rushed up from all sides. In an instant, thousands of men surrounded Napoleon, despite the enemy guns which concentrated their fire on this immense group. The Emperor wished to spare his troops this unnecessary danger, and to calm the anxiety of the distant corps that were already moving to come to him. Scarcely dressed, he mounted his horse and rode along the front of all the lines, amid the acclamations of those brave warriors whom he had so often led to victory. It was during that improvised inspection, passed before the enemy, that Napoleon granted, for the first time, dotations to ordinary soldiers by naming them Knights of the Empire, at the same time making them members of the Legion of Honor. The presentations were made by the regiment commanders, yet the emperor allowed soldiers who believed they had indisputable claims to come and assert them before him. Then he decided and judged alone. Thus it happened that an old grenadier who had served in the Italian and Egyptian campaigns, not having been called, came in a phlegmatic tone to request the cross. "But," said Napoleon to him, "what have you done to deserve this reward?" "It was I, sire, who, in the desert of Jaffa, under an awful heat, presented you with a watermelon." "I thank you again for that, but the gift of that fruit is not worth the cross of the Legion of Honor." Then the grenadier, until then cold as ice, stirred up to the pitch of frenzy, cried out with the greatest volubility, "Eh, do you then count as nothing the 7 wounds received at the bridge of Arcola, at Lodi, at Castiglione, at the Pyramids, at Saint-Jean d'Acre, at Austerlitz, at Friedland, 11 campaigns in Italy, in Egypt, in Austria, in Prussia, in Poland, in—" But the emperor interrupted him, and, mimicking with a laugh the vehemence of his speech, exclaimed, "Ta-ta, ta-ta-ta! How you get carried away when you reach the essential points! For that is where you should have begun, and it is worth much more than your melon. I make you a Knight of the Empire with 1,200 francs of endowment. Are you satisfied? But, sire, I prefer the cross. You have both, since I make you a knight. I would rather have the cross." The brave grenadier would not leave the matter, and all sorts of difficulties were encountered in making him understand that the title Knight of the Empire carried with it that of Knight of the Legion of Honor. He was not reassured on that point until the emperor had pinned the decoration on his breast, and he seemed infinitely more affected by that than by the gift of 1,200 francs in annuity. By this familiarity, the emperor made himself adored by the soldier, but this method can only be properly employed by a commander of armies illustrious from numerous victories. It would harm and discredit any other general. Marshal Lannes having been informed that everything was ready for the attack, we returned toward Ratisbon, while the emperor mounted again on the mound from which he could witness the assault. The various army corps drawn up around him awaited in silence what was about to happen. Our artillery having completely demolished the house on the rampart, its debris fallen into the ditch formed a fairly practicable embankment, the top of which was still 8 to 10 feet lower than the wall on the town side. It was therefore necessary to place ladders on these ruins to gain the top of the rampart. They were also necessary to descend from the promenade into the ditch, as there existed no ramp on that side. Upon arriving at the barn, behind which Division Morand, appointed for the attack, was sheltered from the fire of the place, Marshal Lannes, having asked for 50 men of good will to march at the head of the column and plant the ladders so as to be the first to mount the assault, far more presented themselves than the number prescribed, and he was obliged to reduce them to the figure he had set. These brave men, led by chosen officers, set out with admirable ardor. But scarcely had they passed beyond the walls of the barn that sheltered them, when, assailed by a hail of bullets, they were almost all laid flat on the ground. A few only managed to descend from the promenade into the ditch, but the cannon soon put them out of action, and the remains of that first column, all bloody, rejoined the division behind the protective barn. Meanwhile, at the voice of Marshal Lannes and General Morand, 50 new volunteers presented themselves, took ladders, and marched toward the ditches. But as soon as, having reached the promenade, they were spotted by the enemy, a fire more terrible even than the first almost entirely destroyed this second column. These 2 consecutive failures having chilled the ardor of the troops, nobody moved when, for the 3rd time, the marshal asked for men of good will. He could have ordered 1 or more companies to march, and they certainly would have obeyed. But he knew from experience the enormous difference between what a soldier does from obedience and what he does from impulse. To brave that immense peril, volunteers were infinitely preferable to a commanded troop. But in vain the Marshal renewed his appeal to the bravest of brave division around. In vain he pointed out that the Emperor and the whole Grand Army were watching them. Only a gloomy silence answered him, so convinced was each man that to pass beyond the walls of the barn, under the enemy's fire, was to run to a certain death. Then the intrepid Lannes cried, "Well then, I will show you that before being a marshal, I was a grenadier, and still am one." He seized a ladder, shouldered it, and wanted to carry it toward the breach. His aides-de-camp tried to prevent him, but he resisted and became indignant with us. I then allowed myself to say to him, "Monsieur the Marshal, you would not wish us to be dishonored, and we would be, if you were to receive the slightest wound while carrying a ladder against the rampart, before all your aides-de-camp had been killed." Then, despite his efforts, I tore from him the end of the ladder he held, and placed it on my shoulder, while de Viry took the other end, and our comrades, joining in pairs, also took ladders. At the sight of a marshal of the empire contending with his aides-de-camp over who should mount first to the assault, a cry of enthusiasm rose through the whole division. Officers and soldiers wanted to march in front, and, claiming that honor, they pushed us, my comrades and I, trying to seize the ladders. But in surrendering them we would have seemed to have put on a show to excite the troops' ardor. The wine had been drawn. It had to be drunk, however bitter it might be. The Marshal understood that, and let us do it, although he expected to see a large part of his staff exterminated, which had to march in front of that perilous attack. I have already told you that my comrades, though all very brave, lacked experience, and, notably, what is called military tact. I therefore took command of the small column without ceremony. The gravity of the circumstances authorized me to do so, and no one refused me. I organized behind the barn the detachment that was to follow us. I had attributed the destruction of the first two columns to the imprudence with which those who led them had massed the soldiers composing them, a circumstance that presented a double inconvenience. First, it facilitated the enemy's fire, which is always infinitely more murderous on a mass than on isolated men. Secondly, our grenadiers carrying ladders, having formed only a single group and having gotten in each other's way, their march could not be rapid enough to remove them quickly from the Austrians' fire. Consequently, I decided that de Viry and I, who carried the first ladder, would start first alone, running, that the second ladder would follow us at 20 paces distance, and so on for the others. That, once on the promenade, the ladders would be placed 5 feet from one another, to avoid confusion. That, after descending into the ditch, the even-numbered ladders would be left placed against the wall of the promenade, so that the troops could follow us without delay. That the odd-numbered ladders would be taken up and carried quickly to the breach, where we would set them only a foot apart from one another, both because of the narrowness of the passage, and to approach the top of the rampart with greater cohesion and repel the besieged, who would try to precipitate us down. These explanations being well given and well understood, Marshal Lannes, who approved them, exclaimed, "Go, my brave children, and Ratisbon is taken." At that signal, de Viry and I sprang forward, crossed the promenade at a run, and plunged our ladder into the ditch, where we descended. Our comrades and 50 grenadiers followed us. In vain did the town's cannon thunder, the fusillade roll, and the Biscayens and bullets strike the trees and walls. Because it is very difficult to target isolated individuals moving very quickly and spaced 20 paces apart, we reached the ditch without any man of the small column being wounded. The ladders, taken as planned, were carried to the top of the debris of the demolished house, and, propping them against the parapet, we hurled ourselves toward the rampart. I was climbing, at the head, one of the first ladders. L'Abbé Doyer, who was ascending the ladder next to me, feeling that its base was insecure on the rubble, begged me to give him my hand to steady him, and at last the two of us reached the top of the rampart, in sight of the Emperor and the whole army, who greeted us with a tremendous acclamation. It was one of the finest days of my life. De Viry and d'Albuquerque joined us in an instant, as did the other aides-de-camp and the 50 grenadiers. Finally, a regiment of Division Morand was advancing toward the ditch at a run. The chances of war are sometimes very strange. The first 2 French columns had been destroyed before reaching the foot of the breach, while the third suffered no loss. My friend de Viry alone was struck by a bullet that tore off a button from his greatcoat. Yet, if the enemy on the parapet had kept enough presence of mind to fix bayonets and fall forward on Labédoyère and me, it is more than probable that, overwhelming us by their numbers, they would have killed us or driven us back into the ditch. But the Austrians lose their heads very easily. Our audacity and the swiftness of the attack astonished them so much that, on seeing us run toward the breach, they at first slackened their fire and soon ceased shooting. Not only did none of their companies march against us, but all of them withdrew in the opposite direction from the point we had just taken. You know that the attack took place near the Straubing Gate. Marshal Lannes had ordered me to have it opened or forced, so that he could enter the town with Division Morand. Therefore, as soon as I saw on the rampart my 50 grenadiers, who would soon be joined by the regiment sent to support us, the head of which was already in the ditch where more numerous ladders provided the passage, I descended into the town without delay. The moments were precious. We therefore marched resolutely toward the Straubing Gate, situated 100 paces from the breach, and there my astonishment was great on seeing an Austrian battalion massed beneath the immense vault that precedes that gate, all its men facing toward it in order to be better able to defend it if the French broke it down. Solely intent on the mission entrusted to him, the enemy battalion commander, paying no heed to the noise heard on the neighboring rampart, had not even posted a sentry outside the vault to warn him of what was happening, so certain was he that the French would fail in their attacks. He was therefore stupefied to see us arrive from behind. He was positioned at the rear of his troop, so that, having turned about on seeing us approach, he found himself face to face with the small French column, whose strength he could not judge, for I had formed it into 2 platoons which, braced against the sides of the vault, completely blocked it. At the cries of surprise from the enemy commander, his entire battalion turned, and the rear sections, now at the front, levelled their muskets at us. Our grenadiers aimed at them too, and, as we were only a pace from each other, imagine what a horrible massacre would have followed the first shot fired. The situation of both parties was very perilous. However, the great number of Austrians gave them an immense advantage, for if a close-range firefight had begun, our small column and the company of enemies at the muzzles of our guns would have been destroyed, while the remainder of their battalion would have been free. We were therefore very fortunate that our adversaries could not know how few we were, and I hastened to tell the enemy battalion commander that, the town being taken by assault and occupied by our troops, he had no choice but to lay down his arms on pain of being cut down. The tone of assurance with which I spoke intimidated that officer all the more easily because he heard the tumult produced by the successive arrival of soldiers from the French regiment, who, having followed us through the breach, were rushing to form in front of the vault. The enemy commander harangued his battalion, and after I explained to him the situation in which he found himself, he ordered the arms to be laid down. The companies placed at the muzzles of our guns obeyed, but those gathered near the gate at the other end of the vault, sheltered from our fire, began to shout, refused to surrender, and pressed the mass of the battalion that nearly overwhelmed us. However, the officers managed to calm their men, and everything seemed to be settling, when the hot-headed Labédoyère, impatient at this slowness, nearly lost everything in a fit of anger. Seizing the Austrian commander by the throat, he was about to plunge his sabre into his body, if my comrades and I had not averted the blow. The enemy soldiers then took up their arms again, and a bloody melee was about to ensue, when the city gate resounded from the outside beneath the violent blows of axes struck by the sappers of Division Morand, led in person by Marshal Lannes. The enemy soldiers, realizing then that they were about to find themselves between two fires, surrendered, and we made them march out of the vault unarmed, directing them into the town to clear the gate, which we opened for the marshal, whose troops poured into the place like a torrent. The marshal, after complimenting us, ordered a march toward the Danube bridge to cut off all retreat for the enemy regiments in Ratisbon and to prevent Prince Charles from sending them reinforcements. But scarcely had we entered the main street when a new danger threatened us. Our shells had set several houses on fire, and the blaze was about to spread to some 30 wagons that the enemy had abandoned after removing the horses. The ignition of those wagons would certainly have impeded the passage of our troops, but, by slipping along the walls, we hoped to avoid that obstacle, when suddenly the enemy battalion commander, whom I presented to the marshal, cried out in the accent of the deepest despair, "Victors and vanquished, we are all lost. Those wagons are filled with powder." The marshal turned pale, as did we all, but soon regaining his composure, in the presence of the death before our eyes, the marshal ordered the ranks of the French column to be opened, the muskets to be laid against the houses, and the soldiers to push those wagons by hand, passing them from hand to hand to hand, until they had passed through the vault and were out of the town. The marshal set the example. Officers, generals, and soldiers each set to work. The Austrian prisoners did as the French did, for their lives were also at stake. A large quantity of burning embers was already falling on the wagons, and if one of them had caught fire, we would all have been crushed and the town utterly destroyed. But they worked with such ardor that, in a few minutes, all the powder wagons were pushed outside the square, from where they were dragged by prisoners to the great park of our artillery. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.